Hello, you're watching Scotland at 7. And in the Glasgow studio, it's myself, Hugh, Stewart, and we also have Linda Fabiani, who's a former Deputy Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament. Good evening, Linda.
Good evening.
And today it's the 11th of March, and it's day 16 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, Linda, I'm going to begin running through the latest Ukraine news that we picked up today. The UK government has urged British veterans not to travel to Ukraine to fight. Veteran Minister Leo Doherty called on ex-service personnel not to join the war in Ukraine and instead help Ukrainians from home, either through charity or volunteering. A total of 48 schools have been destroyed in Kharkiv, its mayor said today, as that city comes under relentless bombardment. As of today, 48 of the city's schools have been destroyed, said the Mayor Ihor Terekhov in a television address. The regional governor of Kharkiv has condemned today's attacks on a psychiatric hospital, saying it was a war crime against civilians. Ukraine has accused Russian forces of hitting a psychiatric hospital near the eastern Ukrainian town of Izium. Russian forces shelled residential areas of Kharkiv 89 times in one day, the local governor has said. Reuters reports that Oleh Senegubov also said that there's no danger to civilians after the institute with a nuclear lab was hit. Vladimir Putin today approved bringing thousands of fighters from the Middle East to fight for Russia against Ukraine. At a meeting of Russia's Security Council, Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu said there were 16,000 volunteers in the Middle East who are ready to come and fight with Russian-backed forces in the eastern Ukraine in the breakaway Donbass region. The European Union will double the amount it's spending on providing military support to Ukraine to £1 billion. It has been announced at the Leaders' Summit today in Versailles. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said the agreement among the 27 had not been difficult to secure. Lithuania's president, Gitanas Nausėda, said there was a flavour of disappointment to the decision by the EU leaders today in Versailles not to offer Ukraine a fast track to their EU candidate status in response to Volodymyr Zelensky's request. The UN Migration Agency reports that as of today, more than 2.5 million people have fled Ukraine. Of the total, the International Organization for Migration said that 116,000 were third country nationals. Russian forces have killed more Ukrainian civilians than soldiers, Ukraine's defence minister said today. I want this to be heard not only in Kyiv but all over the world, said Oleksiy Reznikov. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia was a terrorist state in his latest video address. The world must know it, the world must acknowledge it, he said, and also accused Russian forces of attacking a convoy of humanitarian aid for the besieged city of Mariupol. The daughter of Sergei Lavrov's alleged mistress should be among the family members of Vladimir Putin's associates targeted with sanctions, MPs and campaigners have said. Russian forces appear to be regrouping in order to encircle Kyiv in a potentially significant military development. Satellite images released by US company Maxar Technologies on yesterday, appear to show that the large Russian military convoy last seen northwest of Kyiv had largely dispersed and redeployed. Maxar said its pictures show that armoured units have fanned out through towns and forests in the area, with military pieces moved into potential firing positions. US President Joe Biden will announce another ratcheting up of the economic pressure on Friday when he calls for the end of normal trade relations with Russia. This measure will cast Russia into the economic wilderness along with Cuba and North Korea and deepen the recession which the IMF says is already beginning to bite. The United Nations Security Council convened today at Russia's request, diplomats said, to discuss Moscow's claims of US biological activities in Ukraine. The British public will be able to offer accommodation to Ukrainian refugees as the government announces a new route to the UK for those fleeing the Russian invasion. So, Linda, those are the main headline points tonight. Are any of those in particular that stand out for you?
Well, it's just so depressing in general. Everything's happening every day. We have more. I think what stands out for me today, as it did, I think it was yesterday as well, is what seems to be the deliberate targeting by the Russian aggressors of hospitals. Today it was a psychiatric hospital, and of course it was a maternity hospital, and with mothers and children targeted yesterday. So that really stands out for me. Civilians being deliberately targeted, the cost of war, absolutely awful. And as you said, Hugh, there's more civilians being killed already than military. And sadly, that's the way that wars these days happen. So that really, really stands out for me, as does the what I believe to be, having read quite a lot about it over the last couple of days, the false claims by Putin and his cohorts that, the US within Ukraine is now looking at chemical weapons, etc. It's another tactic that we've heard over the years.
Well, we're going to move on to that story in a couple of minutes.
That's really worrying.
But I guess the main thing we've read out there, the main thing that stands out to me, of course, is, as you say, is casualties.
Yeah.
So we've heard before that cities have been bombed. We've also heard that the Russians are using weapons that are normally banned. Most countries don't use things like cluster bombs. I noticed today significantly the US has not joined the convention to ban cluster bombs. So does that maybe dilute the moral authority of the West?
Well, I remember the campaign, I think it was in the 1990s, the anti-cluster bomb campaigns that were going on. And I do remember at the time America refusing to join. I'm not up to date on where any negotiations were with that. Moral authority, I think in any case of war and in all large powerful nations, there is a problem with moral authority in so many things, whether it be the sale of arms or the use of arms. That's a problem.
Many things are going to change, aren't they, at the end of this war? Because for a start, we mentioned earlier on that the European Union is pretty united. As they said today, they didn't have to argue too long about their support. This is unprecedented. Ursula von der Leyen pointed out yesterday that the EU has never before voted military expenditure for another country. So we're going to be in a changed Europe, aren't we, once this is all over?
I think that's certainly the case. I mean, there will be a look at, the European Union again with a view to other states joining. Because, the reality is, since we haven't had European countries within the EU fighting each other, we still don't. But there is a view for enlargement of the European Union. And I think it's a very, very valid view. And there'll be discussions going on everywhere about how we best maintain the peace. I'm really pleased that the EU has been together in this, but we shouldn't be naive about it. Part of it is self-interest as well. When you look at the neighbouring countries around Ukraine, there are EU members there. There are NATO members. So, it's a case of, yes, there's a humanitarian issue there, but there is also a self-preservation issue there that has to be addressed.
The question of joining the EU did come up in the EU's meeting, the council meeting. They've been in Versailles for the last couple of days. So I think we quoted the president of Lithuania saying progress is very slow. Now, the timescales are very long anyway. A couple of weeks ago we had Anthony Salamone on, who's a European expert from Edinburgh, and he's saying for Scotland to join as an independent country, already democratic, without any border issues, 5 years would be quick, really. So I don't know how quickly President Zelensky expects to join, but there's a lot to be done before you join.
I really believe if the will is there, it can be done. I'm not saying that I think the EU can immediately say, yes, Ukraine can join tomorrow or whatever. There's other implications to that as well. We do have treaties there within the EU that are agreed amongst the member states about conditions for joining. There's always a case to relook at these again. So perhaps, as you say, European Union is changing. Europe as a whole may be changing. So once we achieve peace again in Europe, yes, all these things should be on the table and looked at.
Yeah, perhaps there might be some sort of transitional arrangement anyway, perhaps. I mean, one thing that's never happened before is the EU saying to millions of people, like, you can come, never mind about visas, just come over and you've got food, you've got accommodation, you've got the right to work, you've got the right to travel. So
Yeah.
that itself is a huge relaxation
I
of
think
normal
it's,
rules.
I mean, I am very, very cheered and heartened by the humanitarian response of the European Union. Certainly not cheered and heartened by the UK response in so many ways, but I think the EU in this regard have acted really quickly and properly. Again, I mean, we have to be realistic, and there's a degree of self-preservation amongst that as well. Neighbouring states, it's very easy for us as an island community not to understand properly what it means to be in a landmass of different nation states where borders change all the time. So there is a degree of self-interest in the EU states, but I think the humanitarian response collectively by the EU and particularly by the countries round about Ukraine, you know, when you look at Poland and you look
let's
at
have a
Romania,
look at the map so that we
marvellous.
can see where
Yeah.
those countries are. It helps me if we can identify where we are. So up at the north, of course, is Belarus. So Belarus, of course, was used as part of the Russian preparations. Belarus, interestingly, is trying to distance itself right now. They did allow the Russians to attack from Belarus, but they don't want their own troops to be involved in it. And also, you see the countries that some of the countries that we've been to. We've been to Poland and we've been to I've been to Slovakia. So those are the EU countries to the east. Sorry, to the west. Excuse me. It certainly is a country that is in the middle of Europe.
Oh, absolutely. And when you look at it, you know, when you look at Russia as an aggressor and you look at the states round about the Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine itself was part of the Soviet Union. You then look, you've got Hungary there to the west. You know, those of us of a certain age can remember when Hungary bore the brunt of, it was Soviet aggression at the time.
You mean 1956?
Czech Republic as well suffered from, at the time it was Czechoslovakia. So, you know, there's memories in these countries too. We worry about some of the government stuff that's going on in Hungary, for example, the very right-wing government and the way they have been dealing with refugees and migrants over the last years. But when they look at what's happened in Ukraine, it must have hit them like a ton of bricks to remember back what happened to them. And they're a nation state, a sovereign nation state, and they're thinking, well, that doesn't appear to matter to Vladimir Putin. So what's going to happen to us in the future?
Yes, that's right. So, well, again, the Ukrainians have often said, you have to defend us because we're also defending you. Now, the next story, which you've mentioned earlier, really, but you were talking about, well, the idea of fake news, the idea of false flag. I think you said false flag, didn't you? There's a story today because this afternoon, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, the United Nations Security Council has been meeting. Now, Russia put the unfounded claims of a US-orchestrated biological weapon plot in Ukraine before the UN today. Right, so we're going to move on to the update because they were meeting this afternoon. So what happened is that the meeting of the Security Council was called by Russia, and they're saying we've got evidence that America is going to use biological weapons, but they haven't produced the evidence. So I've just got the update in my hands here. So this has been happening in New York this afternoon, their time. So United Nations today said it was not aware of any biological weapons program in Ukraine, while Washington and its allies voiced concerns that Russia was spreading an unproven claim in order to launch its own biological or chemical attacks. So as I said, Russia called the meeting of the UN Security Council today, where all 15 nations attended in New York, and they made the unsubstantiated accusation that Ukraine was running biological warfare labs with US support. So they haven't provided any evidence for this, but that's what the UN meeting was called to discuss. The move risks backfiring on Moscow as members rejected its assertions as a lie and utter nonsense and used the session to amplify accusations that Russia had deliberately targeted and killed hundreds of civilians during its now 16-day-old invasion, which is what President Putin calls a special military operation. The UN High Representative for Disarmament Naximutu said to the Council that the United Nations is not aware of any biological weapons program in Ukraine, which had ratified a ban on these weapons, as has Russia. The Russian envoy to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, repeated the claim without providing any evidence that Ukraine ran biological weapons labs with support from the US Defense Department. I'll just finally in reply, because the US is cited here as being part of this so-called plot. The US envoy to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said Washington was deeply concerned that Russia has called the session as a false flag effort aimed at laying the groundwork for its own use of biological or chemical weapons. A bold move, this. The Russians have said, they've actually gone to the UN and said, we accuse the Americans of proposing biological weapons. And so, no evidence, but is that because they are actually doing that themselves?
Well, that's potentially the case. But, one of the things, certainly, that Mr. Putin has been doing is carrying out internal propaganda within Russia itself to keep the population behind him. That might be part of it as well. If the Russian population believe that their soldiers are going to be targeted with chemical warfare, or if they believe that the areas which the Russians are saying are Russian areas of Ukraine are going to be targeted with chemical or biological warfare, it keeps a justification in their minds for Putin to be behaving the way he does, and also buoys them up against the economic sanctions that must be now starting to bite on ordinary Russians every day. So it's all part of the propaganda of war. And I mean, certainly the regime in Russia has not been averse for a long, long time now in putting out fake news and intervening in affairs of other nations.
Yep. Yes, a number of people I've been following on Twitter from Ukraine have said, if you're surprised at this kind of behaviour by Russia, then you haven't been paying attention.
Yeah.
They've done it before.
Yeah.
And just to finally underline that point again, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, speaking in the UN for America, said that Russia has a track record of falsely accusing other countries of the very violations that Russia itself is perpetrating.
Well, in a very small case, remember the poisonings down south in England. What was it, about 3 years ago now?
Of
was it Salisbury?
Of Skripal in Salisbury, yes.
Yeah. They accused straight off. They accused it of having been a UK plot, a Brit plot. And of course we know it wasn't.
And that's another point, actually. The Americans are also worried about whether poisoning could be used. So this could be a pretext for chemical attack, and then saying it was the Americans that did it.
It was used, not by Russia, I'm not accusing them of that, but if you remember in Iraq, the chemical warfare against the Kurds in northern Iraq, not that many years ago.
Well, that was, of course, done by Saddam Hussein when he was our ally.
Well, yes, and there, back to that question of moral authority, and also, there was your man in Syria. They
were used in Syria.
Used in Syria as well.
Maybe not directly by Russians, but clearly the Russians were backing the Syrian regime.
Yeah.
Okay, so false flag and misinformation. I suppose that's always been a weapon of war. It's trying to change the narrative, change the reality. So let's move on to the next story now, and we're going to talk about the latest military news, as if I knew anything about this, Linda, because I'm the best armchair general we have in this station. Now, what we hear today is that the Russia seems to be widening its attack. The Russian airstrikes today hit 3 cities in Ukraine on Friday, that's today, including 2 in the country's west. So once again, let's have a look at that map and we'll see the significance of today's news as the scope of its military offensive has widened. Now, the raids today hit airfields in Lutsk and Ivano-Frankivsk, far from the main areas of conflict. So let's just identify those. So we're talking about over on the west of the map. Ivano-Frankivsk is to the left of those 2. And, it's the one at the bottom, the other one is Lutsk up at the top there. So those are far away from the main fighting, which really has been around the Black Sea or over at the east by the border with Russia. So it looks like this is a shifting of the conflict over to there. I think it's mainly been shelling or missiles rather than street fighting. However, far from the main areas of conflict, residential buildings in the strategically important city of Dnipro also have been attacked, and that sits in the Dnieper River. Now, let me just identify the Dnieper River for you. If you go up to the top of the map, Kyiv, of course, is highlighted there towards the Belarus border. And if you follow the huge Dnieper River way down, I don't know if you can see Dnipro Privotsky. We haven't underlined that one because there are two Dnieper towns there. I'm not sure which one that means. But it's towards the bottom third of the Dnieper River. And again, that's new attacks there on residential buildings. The air raids came as new satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies showed that the 40-mile convoy that had been approaching Kyiv has dispersed. Tanks and artillery are moving into what appears to be firing positions to the northwest of Kyiv. Right, the Ukrainian military said that Russia is trying to block Kyiv by taking out defences to the west and to the north of the capital, adding that there's also a risk to Brovary on the east. The mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, said that around 2 million people, that's half of the population from the metropolitan area, have now left the capital as preparations continued for its defence. Every street, every house is being fortified, he said. Ukrainian soldiers described fierce fighting for control of the main highway leading into the capital, while missile strikes were reported hitting Velika Dymerka, just outside Kyiv's city limits. Despite heavy losses of personnel and equipment in the third week of Russia's brutal assault on Ukraine, in which cities have been placed under siege and subjected to bombardment, Vladimir Putin's forces were pushing ahead with their campaign. The airstrike on Lutsk military airfield earlier on Friday today left 2 members of the Ukrainian forces dead and 6 people wounded, according to the head of the surrounding Volyn region, that's Yuri Poluayko. Images of the aftermath showed what appeared to be a massive explosion which set fire to what appeared to be fuel storage tanks and created the runway. Lutsk residents said they were woken at 6:45 a.m. Friday this morning when 4 Russian rockets hit the city's military aerodrome. 3 Russian airstrikes also hit the eastern industrial city of Dnipro early Friday, killing at least 1 person, according to the Ukrainian Interior Minister advisor Anton Heroshenko. They hit an area near a chemical plant, leaving a shoe factory completely destroyed and breaking the windows on a nearby kindergarten. The new wave of strikes came as clear skies on Friday made Russian air operations easier. Despite claiming to have neutralised the Ukrainian air forces and air defences in the first few days of the war, in the last week Russia has hit the Ukrainian Air Force sites a number of times, including striking an airfield in Vyshnitsia, the city that is the headquarters of the Ukrainian Air Force, with 8 cruise missiles hitting in one single attack. Let's have a look at the map again. I think we've got the city of Vinnytsia. Yes, that's again. Remember, I pointed out Ivano-Frankivsk over at the west, so Vyshnitsia is just slightly to the east of that. So that's the main Ukrainian Air Force site attacked by 8 cruise missiles. While a move to a more static approach of shelling Kyiv from outside might be less costly for Russian forces, it is not without risk. The Ukrainian use of Turkish-supplied combat drones has been effective against Russian vehicles, and more static positions would be vulnerable to other Ukrainian aircraft, perhaps explaining the recent stepping up effort to knock out Ukrainian airfields. Okay, so it does look as if the assault on Ukraine is widening out. The Russians have not yet tackled Kyiv, but it looks like they're getting in a position where that might be the next thing to that we'll be reporting on.
I wonder if, I certainly would not pretend to know how all these things work, but looking at the rhetoric of Vladimir Putin and the Russians at the start of all this, I wonder if they thought they would have an easy march, an easy stroll into Kyiv, take over the capital. From reports, it would seem that some of the military thought they would be welcomed, have control of the capital, and then start making demands. But it hasn't quite worked that way because of the bravery and resistance of Ukraine. So they're regrouping, rethinking, and now it's a bit of a terror campaign. And I know that they have been accused of being terrorists, and it certainly looks that way now. It's like a real scare on the population by fanning out that way and then perhaps closing in on the capital from there. And the more people who have fled the capital, the more it may well suit them.
Yes, again, as we saw earlier on the map, Kyiv is in the kind of middle to the north. Most
Yeah.
of the reporters we've been watching are in Lviv over to the
yeah,
west.
Yeah,
So
near
presumably
the
that was
Polish
last
border.
pl-
Yeah.
Aye. So everyone's feeling that's relatively safe. So Lviv has not been attacked yet, and neither has Odessa down on the south. But presumably the Russians will want to go for that next. But talking about the attack and the counter-attack, we've heard today again fighting talk really by President Zelensky. But that
Yeah.
strikes me that's only going to lead to more death. And well, let me just look at the figures we've got
Yeah.
so far. According to the United Nations, there have been 549 civilian deaths and 957 injuries up to the 10th of March, although the real total could be considerably higher. As for military casualties, the US estimates that the Ukrainians have lost between 2,000 and 4,000 people, whereas the Ukrainians themselves estimate that maybe 5,000 to 6,000 Russian soldiers. Sorry, that's the US estimate, 5,000 to 6,000 Russian casualties, whereas the Ukrainians claim that they've killed more than 12,000 Russian troops. So the first comment here is that it's very easy to sit here, isn't it, in a warm studio in Glasgow and talk about thousands of young men being killed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely. When you look at a regime like Vladimir Putin runs in Russia, you could say that some of these young soldiers are victims, same as anyone else. We've all read the reports about mothers being absolutely appalled to discover that their sons were sent to war when they thought they were in training exercises. And they're wee laddies. They're conscripts, basically. They're not professional soldiers. And on both sides in any military conflict like that, you have, we used to call it cannon fodder. And that's the reality of it. Those that decide on war, those that perpetrate war, are never in the front line.
How true.
You know?
Yep.
And then you have, those who have been invaded and who are defending their own homeland, defending their sovereignty. And my goodness, who would ever have been raised with their parents thinking, with their country thinking, and with they themselves thinking that at a young age they were going to end up in a war and having to fight for their very lives and their country. It's awful. There are victims all around. The ones that are not the victims are the ones that make these absolutely appalling decisions for all sorts of reasons that are not valid, but purely for their own power base. And it's awful.
Yes, imperial expansion, yes. I thought that was 19th century, but back there again.
Yeah.
What can we do about it in Scotland? Our next story reports the Scottish Government appointing a new Minister for Refugees. Now, the Minister for Europe and International Development, Neil Gray, has been given responsibility for the Scottish Government's approach to supporting Ukrainian refugees arriving and living in Scotland. Mr Gray will lead the Scottish Government's engagement and partnership work with local authorities, with COSLA, with the third sector and with other agencies, and he will engage with the UK Government to press for a swift and coordinated humanitarian action and support. The Minister will ensure action is integrated with the work the Scottish Government will carry out with COSLA and the others on wider refugee and asylum integration, including the new Scots strategy, and will engage with affected groups in the community. Mr Gray will also attend the Cabinet as required and report directly to the First Minister on the issue. Also today, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has called for immediate action to resettle Ukrainian refugees, pointing to a lack of clarity from the UK Government around settlement programmes and complex visa processes, which is delaying Scotland from welcoming refugees from Ukraine. In a letter to the Prime Minister, co-signed by the leaders of Scottish Labour, the Scottish Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Green Party, the First Minister urged the UK Government to waive visa requirements for Ukrainian nationals seeking refuge in the UK and for a comprehensive and funded settlement programme and package of support to be established. The Scottish Government is working with local authorities and the Scottish Refugee Council to ensure Scotland can welcome Ukrainian refugees with the support they need as soon as they are able to come here. So to me, Linda, there are two stories there worth discussing. There's first of all, let's start at the end there with the complaints about the UK government. Well, we know what the UK government's been doing about helping Ukrainians to get here, which is preventing them from getting here. And the other issue, of course, is how can we as a nation welcome and integrate if people decide to stay here? They may, of course, go back home afterwards. So first of all, do you think the Scottish government is able to bring any leverage to the UK government to basically, let's just call it what it is, the UK government is preventing Ukrainians from coming here by the ludicrous hoops they've made people jump through. Can we stop that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm just stunned when I read about... I can never make up my mind whether it's nastiness, whether it's incompetence, or whether it's a mixture of both. I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think last time I was on here, Priti Patel had just announced there was an easing of restrictions, and I said, well, I don't know the detail yet, devil's in the detail, we'll wait and see. But oh my goodness, it's just ludicrous. And when you're reading in the paper every day, individual examples of even where there's a Scots fella married to a Ukrainian woman, or a Ukrainian man married to a Scotswoman, even they're having problems getting in. I mean, I read a case today where the lassie was told she had to travel 500 miles to register and make her application. And you're like, what, 500 miles in a war zone, You're asked to go on a computer. Like, who's walking about charging their iPad when they're fleeing for their life? So it's just absolutely appalling. Can Scotland do anything about it? Well, we can have a blooming good try. Because it's the right thing to do. Now, I know that Wales feels the same. I'm not so sure about the North of Ireland situation. I haven't read up on that. But the devolved administrations want to do the right thing. So they can put pressure on the UK government. And it's quite simple, as Nicola Sturgeon says, is forget about the blooming paperwork. Get people here, get them safe, and then we'll worry about the paperwork. So that is the right thing to do. Appointing a minister specifically to try and coordinate some of the effort in Scotland is also the right thing to do. And this is not a first. She did that before. I think it was Hamza Yousaf that she appointed before at the time of Syria. And that's about dealing with the voluntary organisations, with the Refugee Council, dealing with COSLA on behalf of all the local authorities. Because in Scotland we want to do the right thing, whether it be local authorities who have proved themselves over the years to be very, very decent people who want to help, whether it be the wonderful voluntary organisations we've got in Scotland, or indeed individuals. Individuals are really pulling out the stops here. The things I've seen are quite amazing. And so, yes, I think we can make a difference by raising awareness and piling pressure on the UK government. I think that Neil Gray's a really good appointment. Neil has served at Westminster, so he does know how stuff works down there. He does know some people down there. So I think he's a really good appointment. He's also a very sensible chap and a very caring chap, very, very capable. Reporting directly to the First Minister is the right thing to do. And the First Minister of Scotland genuinely cares about all this stuff. I know that. So she's doing the absolute best that she can in this. So it's a mixture of pressure, but also when it does get to the point that people are coming to Scotland, making absolutely sure that their transition into Scotland is made as easy as possible. These folk have been through enough. My goodness, terrible.
Do you think there's any issue with people who end up with Ukrainian neighbours thinking, how can I get on? How can I help these people integrate? Language difficulties, other difficulties. Are those the sort of things that COSLA and local authorities have to concentrate on to make sure the welcome is there and that people can mix with the community, permanently
the
if they decide to
voluntary
stay?
sector are the ones that really pull out the stops. When it comes to people actually in communities, and the local authorities do that, and yes, they set programmes in place, of course they do, there's been some wonderful ones, but it's the voluntary organisations and the individuals, it's the churches, it's the community centres, It's small local groups who have a great deal of compassion, who actually make the difference in trying to make people see that they're welcome and that we want them to be part of Scotland until they're in a position where they can make choices again about what they want to do with their lives.
That's, of course, their choice. Yes, people
Yes.
who come here may decide to stay, but it may, of course, it probably is that the vast majority of those 2.5 million fully intend to go back home and, let's face it, rebuild their country. They'll have work to do, won't
absolutely.
they?
I mean, that's the thing that those folk who are totally against migration, totally against refugees and say terrible things, say false things about it. The reality is that most people want to go back. It's home. It's where they have their links. It's where they have all different things that matter in their lives. And yes, most people want to go back and build their nations.
Yep. There's going to be a huge amount of reconstruction to be done anyway with
Yep.
the continued Russian redevelopment of Ukrainian cities. Now, we're going to talk for a couple of minutes now about what other people in Scotland can do to help. We were discussing this before we went on air tonight, and one we heard today was from the University of St Andrews, which has raised £75,000. This is an appeal to raise funds to support University of St Andrews students directly affected by the war in Ukraine. It raised 75,000 quid in just a few hours. The University's Ukraine Hardship Appeal, which was launched in an email to all staff and students from the Vice-Chancellor, who's Professor Sally Mapstone, earlier this week, has received donations of over £75,000 from members of the Development Family Programme, mostly parents of students currently studying at St Andrews. Several generous donations have also been made by university staff who learned of the appeal in the Principal's Ukraine update this week. The appeal, which now has more than 100 donors, will be launched to the St Andrews Global Alumni family in the coming days. The funds have been used to support the over 100 students from the regions affected by the Russian government's invasion of Ukraine. Most of them are currently in St Andrews and a small number remain in Ukraine or Russia. The war has made the futures uncertain, separated families, cut off access to funding and living expenses, and increased stress and mental health pressures hugely. If the conflict continues, some of the St Andrews community may not be able to return home to Ukraine or Russia at the end of the semester. The Hardship Appeal Fund aims to provide peace of mind that St Andrews will remain a safe and supportive haven for anyone directly affected by the war. Some of the university's development team members were moved to tears by the response, and it's confirmation that the university can make a small but positive difference to lives which have been upended by the war. Well, I guess the other universities must have students from Ukraine too. Glasgow, for instance, has a large Eastern European studies faculty. So, again, I didn't realise this, but at the end of term, what are those guys to do? Is Priti Patel going to kick them out of the country?
Well, do you know, Hugh, I heard the very same question being put to a UK government minister. I can't remember who it was. It was somebody I'd never heard of until the poor donkey had been shoved on the radio to answer all the hard questions. And he was asked, well, what about the people that are already here? Have you made provision? Likes the students, likes the, folk that have perhaps been on holiday here staying with relatives. Are you going to kick them out? What are you going to do? And he just waffled on and waffled on. So that's obviously not been sorted yet either. But good on St Andrews. And, and as you say, other universities, indeed colleges, perhaps, businesses that may have workers from Ukraine. I'm absolutely certain that student bodies, university, college bodies, employers all over Scotland are making sure that anybody that they feel they have a direct link with will be protected. And it's like every time I open social media or I listen to the radio, I hear other cases of folk really pulling out the stops to help you. And good on St Andrews University. But I have to mention one thing that I thought was absolutely fabulous was the Scouts. And it was in East Kilbride, it was the 6th Scouts in East Kilbride. And I understand it's a Scouts initiative across the country. They put out a call for people to give them their baby boxes. And I saw this room absolutely filled up with baby boxes. The actual boxes themselves that had gone from the Scottish Government to families. And what they were doing was anything that had been used from that box was getting replaced through other donations, and the boxes are all ready to go out to the neighbouring countries where refugees
So that's
are
just
landing.
a couple of stories.
So loads of stuff like that.
Oh, and by the way, the points you were raising about funding, if anybody wants to learn more of that, we did discuss that last night on Maggie's programme. So
Right.
look on the 10th of March, some more of that was discussed with Maggie's guests. And can I just, while you're talking about, spontaneous efforts, can I just give a shout out to the Deanston Bakery in Shawlands in Glasgow,
right.
because they held a cake sale last Sunday. So I went along and ate cakes for Ukraine, and they raised 25,000. We just held on Twitter a couple of days later. They opened all day Sunday, and all the proceeds were to go to Ukraine. 25,000. So there's probably loads of things like that happening about the place.
Well, the Disasters Emergency Committee have said that that they are stunned by the amount of financial donations that have been made. And that's a grouping of lots of different charities that work on the ground. So yeah, people are generous when they see this kind of treatment.
Okay, and I've just heard an update. Yeah, I think that Deanston one has continued to increase since then. I've heard a figure of 74,000. So
Oh my
let's
goodness.
see if the South Side can beat St Andrews University by the end of the week. Okay, let's move on to, this is a sort of regular story. This is the kind of story we used to do before Putin started the war. Right, so the preferred bidder has been named for a contract to build 2 new ferries to help support the community and economy of Islay. Caledonian Maritime Assets, which is the purchasing division of CalMac, intends to award the contract for these 2 ferries to the Cemre Marine Industry shipyard in Turkey, following the 10-day standstill period. I think that's the period of due diligence while they check the details of the contract. In that the new vessels will bring an almost 40% increase vehicle and freight capacity on the Islay routes, which is a reduction plus a reduction in emissions, and will improve the resilience of the whole fleet. The first vessel is expected to be delivered by October 2024 and will enter service following sea trials and crew familiarisation. The second vessel will follow in early 2025. So I was trying to find the details of this boat, but I assume this must be some sort of new low pollution engine. So I guess that must be part of the tender. But anyway, that's good news that that's a fairly short timescale. What happened was, I think the bidders for the contract was narrowed down to 4, and the 4 of the 4, the final contract went to Cemre. And I've had a look at their website. They make a lot of medium-sized boats for different purposes. They do a lot of passenger ferries and trawlers. So obviously they're ready to deliver in time. So from contract to delivering in 2024, that seems quite quick to me. I don't know how quickly
certainly
you
seems
normally
quick.
build a boat.
Yeah, it seems quick to me as well, yeah. Yeah, I guess you should say there'll be due diligence and they'll look at it all. And, the way the world works now is things go out to tender globally, don't they? And come back in, best values looked for, so...
Well, it's best value. And also, if Scotland were in the European Union, it would be necessary to tender, to invite anyone to tender, and you just give the contract to the best bidder.
Do you know, I wasn't aware that Turkey was a big shipbuilding or... why
That was
wouldn't
news
it?
to
Why
me,
wouldn't
so-
it be?
Well,
But,
it was just this
yeah.
afternoon, I was looking at Cemre's website,
Yeah.
so they're obviously are pretty big.
Yeah.
So we have nobody in Scotland of that scale who can build boats of that, and they're obviously making a lot of boats. They've got a big order book. So
Yeah.
we just don't have scale shipbuilding in Scotland.
Well, yeah, and yes, and there have been issues, as we know, with Ferguson's. I don't know the detail where that's at just now, but I don't know if they tendered or otherwise.
No, it didn't look like they made it to the final list anyway, but obviously people in Islay have been quoted saying that's great, that there is this extra capacity. I guess what they mean by resilience is too, there's always a chance of maybe moving one of them to another route if one of the other older ferries breaks down.
And the
which does
stated
happen.
time scale is really impressive.
Yep, so that's good news for Islay there and for communications. Now, another Scottish story. A new framework to shape Scotland's health and social care workforce over the next decade places training, well-being, job satisfaction and the principles of fair work at its heart. The National Workforce Strategy for Health and Social Care in Scotland, co-produced with COSLA, identifies the 5 key areas which will support the creation of a sustainable, skilled workforce as the sector rebuilds from the pandemic. The publication, the first of its kind, stresses the need to plan, attract, train, employ and nurture staff. Over the next 5 years, the strategy commits to increasing the NHS workforce by 1,800 full-time posts. These posts are in addition to the projected required workforce growth. Later this year, the Scottish Government will publish for the first time projections of required workforce growth across health and social care, which will be reviewed annually. Other key factors include, firstly, investing £11 million over this Parliament to establish the Centre for Workforce Supply and fund recruitment campaigns to grow the health and social care workforce. Secondly, to increase the number of undergraduate medical school places over the course of this Parliament by 500. Thirdly, supporting up to 1,800 training places through the National Transitions Training Fund for those interested in roles in adult social care. And thirdly, recruiting 800 additional GPs by 2028. Fourthly, further improving staff wellbeing measures which have already been supported by record financial investment this year. And next, increasing frontline health spending by at least 20% over this Parliament and increasing adult social care investment by at least 25%. Health boards, local authorities and health and social care partnerships will play a central role in developing the strategy through the 3-year workforce plans, with the first of which will be developed this year. So we've heard quite a lot, Linda, about workforce planning. I guess this is the idea that you look at the needs over the next period, is it 5 years or so, and then you look at what you've got and you see what training do we need. So has the Scottish Government not really been doing adequate workforce planning up to now?
Well, I think it's ongoing. 5 years is a very short time. When you look at that, when you consider how long it takes for a doctor to be trained, for example. So yes, these workforce planning things are constant and go on. But the new element of this, I think, is the social care element of it. Aside from this absolute medical health service side, it's the social care element, which we're going to have the National Social Care Plan, agency, whatever it turns out to be. And that is the part of it that worries me most. I mean, I do have concerns about recruitment in some of the specialisms in the health service, because that's always been an ongoing issue. I know that, certainly Lanarkshire Health Board, they had real problems trying to recruit, specialists at certain levels. I have concerns about GP numbers. There's so many GPs now work part-time, for example. And there seems to be an issue about getting people to specialise in being general practitioners. That sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? Specialise in being general, but you know what I mean. But the new element of it, I think, is the one that's going to really, really need a lot of work put into it. Fair work for a start, because we have undervalued social care workers for far too long. Folk that do the very important work of working in nursing homes, for example, working in communities, house visits, hospital at home, as they call it. So all of that, and my real concern about it is that we get it right in fair work terms and pay people decently, but my other concern is it's not just the planning, it's the recruitment. Because if you widen that out and look at the number of people, for example, that come from EU countries, and we're no longer in the EU, freedom of movement has been stopped in the EU. That is an ongoing problem. So training, and a lot of the colleges are doing really good stuff already, but whether they're able to fill the courses is another thing. But I worry about capacity of that service when it becomes a national service. And I know that the Scottish Government must be trying to plan for that over a longer than 5-year period. But I don't think it's going to be easy. It's not just a case of throwing money at this. People are involved as well.
So the other issue here is about, of course, the integration, as you mentioned, integration between health and social care. Is it your impression that Scotland is quite well advanced? It's been recognised for a long time now that you can't keep them separate, medical staff have to ask patients, like, what is your situation at home? Have you got somebody looking after you? So it's really essential in some cases to make sure that the social services are working hand in hand with the medics.
Aye, but it's not even just the social services, it's social care, which is a different thing. Now, there is an issue with social services having to work together with social care, with the medics. And yes, Scotland is quite far ahead in UK terms. And we have health and social care partnerships that have been established for a good few years now. But there are bumps there are issues. And most of them are down to not having enough folk on the ground. And that's what I mean about capacity. That's where it really matters. That's what it really matters about somebody that's in hospital for the shortest possible time, and then they get cared for in their own home, and you don't have that big long wait. You know, there are issues about folk living in the communities that really need an awful lot of care. And there are issues about nursing homes and care homes, and about what's best for the individual. So, yes, we're far ahead, but we've still got a long way to go before it's something that people can have total confidence in. There's great work being done. Of course there is. There are wonderful examples, but there's still blips.
Now, when we talk about the numbers of doctors, extra doctors being recruited, the report makes it clear that there's built-in growth anyway, but the numbers mentioned here are in additional. They are on top of that. But it's worthwhile reminding people that the number of doctors in Scotland for the population is actually already higher, I believe, than it is
Yes,
to the border.
it is, yeah. It is. I can't remember the exact figures, but yes.
Yes, I did see something on that just recently. Now, just my final point here is about, well, it's a query really, because the Scottish Government is committed, of course, to a national care service, a kind of care equivalent of a national health service. Now, I'm afraid I haven't read this report, Linda. I haven't researched that today, but presumably that's part of it as well. Presumably the recruitment would be for a nationalised
Well, that's
care
right.
service.
It's about the health and social care workforce, and and that is the National Care Service. So I haven't read it either because it's just come out. There seems to be an awful lot of reports come out this week that I haven't read. I'll need to spend the weekend catching up. But yeah, the will is there to do it. But it's never as simple as that. But the fact that the will is there to do it, the fact that local authorities are generally on board with this, the fact that trade unions in relation to their workers in the social care workforce want that fair work to be absolutely central to all of it. So the will is there and there are people working together on it. But as I said, I have some concerns mainly about recruitment. You can plan all you like, but if you can't get the people to carry out your plans, then you've got a problem.
Okay, hey, here's the thing. Why doesn't the Scottish Government take charge of employment and immigration? It's a reserve power. That's the issue. Damn. Now, just before we move on to our final story, I'm just going to quickly insert a very brief word or two about the Scottish Green Party conference. Now, we will be discussing it Sunday. They've just started today, and in fact, they haven't sent us anything, so we haven't anything to talk about. So presumably they're all very busy. So we will cover that on the Full Scottish on Sunday. So we're not ignoring you guys; just they're ignoring us. Right.
Well, they must have a lot to talk about. I look forward to hearing what they come up with.
Yep, so that's on Sunday then. Now, finally, we've heard today from the SNP that they have challenged the Scottish former Tory leader Ruth Davidson to ditch her party's conference next week after Boris Johnson confirmed that he will attend in person. Baroness Davidson told Channel 4 that she felt let down by Boris Johnson's leadership as PM. Now the Scottish Tories are rolling out the red carpet for the Prime Minister just weeks after party leader Douglas Ross called for his resignation. Commenting, Stewart, a member of the Scottish Parliament, says Baroness Davidson talks a good game. But will she vote with her feet and ditch the party's conference where the red carpet will be rolled out for Boris Johnson? The situation in Ukraine is absolutely devastating, Kakub said, and the Prime Minister is presiding over a heartless and shambolic refugee policy, refusing to waive visas for refugees and trailing behind on humanitarian aid. But the truth is, this is Kakub Stewart saying, Boris Johnson was already completely unfit for office before the Ukrainian crisis erupted. whether it be presiding over a crippling cost of living crisis or partying in Downing Street while the rest of us followed the rules, Boris Johnson must go. And she continued, Douglas Ross now once again gives his support to Boris Johnson. If Ruth Davidson had any credibility at all left, she'd stick by her own words and give the PM and the party conference the cold shoulder. So yes, I suppose you remember, like me, Ruth Davidson in tears actually lamenting the lack of leadership from Prime Minister Johnson. That was at the time of the Partygate scandal back in January. I don't know if she was on this week. Did you see her this week on? Does she repeat?
Well, no, I would choose not to. I have to say, there's a bit of politicking going on here by the SNP. Of course there is. That's what happens. There's vicious politicking going on every day by the Scottish Tories. I remember Ruth Davidson, even before the tears about Boris Johnson latterly, when he should have gone. I remember her being totally opposed to him being leader. I remember her being totally opposed to his view on the European Union, because the Scottish Tories were for staying. And Ruth Davidson was, for him. She had all sorts of lines in the sand that washed away. So yes, I remember Ruth Davidson with all these things, but also remember her accepting going into the House of Lords by the grace of that same Boris Johnson. So let's not expect that she or Douglas Ross will do anything different than support Boris Johnson. Douglas Ross has been told, the whips have had him by the short and curlies, and he's been told, you'll welcome your leader to the Scottish conference or else. So no surprises here.
So the Northern Rebellion has been snuffed out pretty soon.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, as you were speaking there about dirty politicking, I wonder why the SNP even bothered to talk about Ruth Davidson now, because to me, she's retired from politics. Going to the House of Lords, that means you're finished. That's what people normally do
I mean, I have
at
to
the
say,
end of the career.
When you read that out there, I just thought, this is your standard stuff, And I don't know. I mean, it's said, it gets said. It's probably quite true, but I don't actually think it needs said. I wouldn't give these people the airspace of mentioning them, to be honest. But then I'm not an elected politician anymore, so I can do what I like.
You're a free citizen, but one person we can't avoid talking about, though, is PM Boris Johnson, because I can remember in this very studio discussing with a number of MPs that surely he has to go. Remember those days when we were counting
he should have gone a long time
those
ago.
letters for resignation? But
absolutely.
He's got away with it, hasn't he? Johnson's going to stay. He's going to be there for the next couple of years or for a second term if he wants.
Who knows?
But
I mean, the whole thing down Westminster is completely corrupt. We shouldn't be part of it. Let's hope we're not part of it for too much longer. Everything we have discussed tonight would say to me, Scotland can do these things much better on their own.
Yep, and one of the things we will be looking at on Sunday is if there's any information when the Scottish Parliament is going to start discussing the referendum bill. Patrick Harvey has made it clear today that it is on the agenda and it will be timetabled sometime. I don't know when. Why don't we tune in on Sunday? So we will discuss that and other issues at this Full Scottish, and that's on Sunday lunchtime. So I don't know who our guest is, but I don't suppose you're coming around again. You've got something to do on Sunday.
Do you know, my mind's just gone blank.
Wrong answer. You should have got a full diary already. Okay, well, that's about it for tonight. So on day 16 of Russia's attack on Ukraine. So as I said, we will be back on Sunday lunchtime for the Full Scottish programme. And so thank you very much to Linda Fabiani for driving up from South Lanarkshire to the Glasgow studio. It's always good to see you again. And just finally, can I remind everyone that we are entirely supported by the people who have gone onto our website and clicked and committed to a wee standing order, and that's a website down there. Now, we could do with your help, really. So if you think it's important to have independent broadcasting in Scotland, then please give us a hand. We're not supported by any public funding. We don't get the kind of money the BBC gets, and particularly if the Scottish Government does actually start discussing the date of the next referendum, we think it's going to be particularly important to have fair, impartial broadcasting. We are impartial. We do our best to do fair broadcasting and to look at the issues in a proper journalistic way here, but we can only do that with your support. So thanks for watching, and those of you who are our supporters, thank you very much for keeping us on the air. So that's it from Hugh Stewart, and Linda Fabiani tonight. So we'll be back on Sunday. Thanks for watching. Bye.